Hello, internets. Today it's time to get a little bit abstract. What I want to talk to y'all about today is naming stuff in general and the idea of a lexical gap. So hopefully we're going to bring this around to being a happy human being towards the end, but I think this is just a cool idea and I like it, so why not? So a lexical gap is just a word that's missing from a language, right? So each language has this big inventory of words called its lexicon, and sometimes stuff is missing. And we don't notice them as speakers because it's really hard to notice an absence of something. Unless you know another language in which it's really easy to express an idea that in the primary language you're concerned with you can't express, or it's very difficult and you have to talk around it, and then it's really obvious. So, for example, in English, most of our family-related terms have a masculine, a feminine, and a gender neutral. So we can talk about our mother or our father or our parent. And we can talk about our brother and our sister or our sibling. But we don't actually have a gender neutral word for our parent siblings. So we can say aunt or uncle, but we don't have a word that just means one of those, where we don't specify is this a man or a woman. And that's just interesting that that's absent, and I'm certain that there are languages where it's very easy to convey that. The flip side of that is cousin. Cousin's always neutral. We don't have specific words for female cousin and male cousin. Which, I just got those as examples off of Wikipedia, right? Because I didn't notice that ever until today, even though I know about this idea of a lexical gap. So it's a funny little thing, but it does matter. Because human beings, we're classifying creatures, and it's way, way easier for us to recall, to reason about, and generally kind of wrap our head around stuff we have a word for. And this comes up all the time, actually, in our societies, because people who are having different experiences from sort of the norm of the society tend to invent terms to point at those experiences so they can discuss them. And that's really important for those people, so that they can build communities to support them in understanding the experience that they're having and what it looks like to be a fulfilled human being having those experiences. Unfortunately, problem the first with that is that people not having those experiences tend to resent additions to the language. So people get butthurt when you make up words to talk about your experiences if they are not having those experiences. They go, oh, that's just a bunch of made up nonsense. See all old people ever dealing with young people. Since time immemorial, young people always invent their own slang, invent their own terminology, some of which is just sort of them differentiating themselves from their elders, and some of which is that they're actually having novel experiences. Society has changed, and they need words to talk about things that are going on in their life that weren't happening in their parents' lives or their grandparents' lives. But that's a small and somewhat mundane example of a larger issue, that anytime you are off away from the norm, having a different experience, and inventing the terminology that you require to actually discuss in a meaningful way that experience, you are going to face resentment, backlash. I'm getting texts from my grandma. What's up? Yeah, I'm popular. So that is just something to consider and to be mindful of. If you encounter some people and they're using a bunch of terminology that is completely alien to you and you don't understand what the hell they're talking about, be open to the fact that they may be having experiences that you just haven't had. Thus, you don't see the need for the terminology, but it may be helpful to them. So, just approach people in a generous spirit and have a charitable first take on their use of language. Problem the second is that language is a dual purpose kind of thing in human society. So it's used to convey meaning, right? So it has this sort of semantic value, but it's also used to define group membership and identity. So in-groups and out-groups are often defined by common uses of language. Like, do you speak the way that we speak? Then you're a member of our group. And that's the very deep psychological experience for people, and one that people generally don't examine all that much. So if you are a member of an out-group, you're going to have, unfortunate experiences with people who are a part of the in-group for whatever group it is that's defined by that use of language. And people can want to join groups for all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with sharing in the experiences that created the need for the terminology that defines that group. And so you run into this really tricky spot where any sufficiently sort of deep set of experiences will spawn a terminology that is complex enough to have non-trivial syntactical relationships. So like, here are all these symbols, and to the extent that they are accurately pointing to a set of experiences, then they will have syntactical relationships. This one always goes with this one, or this one never goes with this one, that arise from the actual domain itself. But humans, for whatever reason, are really prone to mistaking an understanding of the syntax of a group of terms for an understanding of the experiences that gave rise to those terms. And so people who join into groups for whatever reason, they want to be a part of this group that has this entire set of terminology, their own sort of domain-specific language, are really in danger of an experience that I like to call syntactic noodling, where you sit down and you fixate on how do all of these terms fit together and when can I use what terms, and feel like you're learning something, because you are learning something. You're learning the syntax of this terminology. But syntax and semantics are very different things. So understanding how different words are allowed to go together is very different from understanding the experiences that gave rise to those words in the first place. And if you want an example of that, spend any time just researching the history of any religious movement ever. Because, what usually happens is there's a founder of some religious movement who's having some incredible experience. They want to share that experience with other people. They start to teach those people about it. There are all sorts of things that those people are unfamiliar with that the founder has to invent terms for. And then the founder disappears somewhere. And the people that were taught have an incomplete understanding of this experience, but they can relate to other people the terms, and you get a couple of generations removed in teaching from the founder, and you have a bunch of people who have this entire vocabulary that they can then push around the symbols in the correct ways that correspond to the way that the founder pushed those symbols around, and none of them have had the experience that actually gave rise to those symbols. And it's a hot mess. So that's problem the second, which is that because language defines group identity in addition to conveying information, and people might want to join the group without actually having any information about why the language arose, you can end up with a bunch of people who think that they know something because they can push the symbols around in the right way. That's unfortunate. Right, so those are some concerns about lexical gaps in the invention of new terminology, naming stuff, right? But let's talk about some benefits. This is where, if you've stuck with me this far, hopefully some opportunities for good things in your life will arise. Inventing terms aids in recall. You have some bundle of sensations and cognitions that makes up some experience. And if that experience is significant to you, you want to be able to remember it, to recall it later, to investigate it when you are in a space where you can really draw some insight out of it. But if you don't have a name for it, it's very difficult to pull that up. At best, you can sort of ritualize the way that you got to having that experience in the first place, but it's very tricky just because of the way that we as information processing systems are set up to pull that sort of thing up unless you have a name for it. But once you have a name for it, you can put your brain's pattern recognition hardware to work for you in your practice of being a happy human being. Because if you're having some experience and you really want to be aware of when that experience is happening, figure out what are the conditions and causes that give rise to that experience, maybe figure out a way to have a different experience. If you have a name for that, then your brain will hunt for it and it'll go, oh, this thing is happening now, this thing that we remember because we have a name, yeah! It just goes on the list of things that your brain is trying to classify. This is a possible classification now because it has a name, so the classifiers kick in when that experience is happening. You wake up into, oh, I'm having this experience that I took the time to create terminology for. Ooh, what's going on? What's the context? What's the environment? I can learn something. One of my favorite examples of this comes from I want to say it's a Korean Zen Buddhist teacher. Yeah, pretty sure he's from Korea. His name is Sang Song, and he talks in his Dharma talks, in his letters to his followers, he has this idea of don't liking mind. And don't liking mind is a very specific set of processes that he identifies as distinct from the individuals who are experiencing those processes. So when he's writing to somebody and they're having they're seeking advice about issues going on in their life. Oh, I don't like this at work. Oh, I don't like this in my school. Oh, I don't. Your don't liking mind is very active here. And once you have don't liking mind as just a terminology pointing to this experience of a generation of an experience of dissatisfaction, as distinct from the conditions under which dissatisfaction is experienced, it's really, really easy to spot that as you're cruising about living your own life. I remember reading this collection of letters and talks from this teacher, and then after that it was like, oh, there's my don't liking mind going again. Oh, there's my don't like it. And hundreds of times a day. It's incredible how much dissatisfaction is generated by an average human being on any given day. So that's just an example of, you invent the terminology, and it doesn't even have to be descriptive terminology. If it's just Fred in your head who tells you hate things, that's fine. Because then when the voice in your head says, oh, I hate, you can go, hi, Fred. How are you doing? I understand that your entire existence is telling me that I hate things, but I'm not interested in that today, Fred. It's been a pleasure seeing you. I'm going to move on to a different experience. And just having the recognition that this experience is kicking off, and then boom, little piece of hardware in the back of your brain goes, that's Fred, by the way. We named that. We know this bundle of sensations. Pattern recognition, that's all we do. It's incredibly helpful. So, to sum up, understand that it's difficult to perceive things and to really get your head around things that you don't have terminology for. Therefore, sometimes, because our language doesn't come equipped with terminology out for sort of off-the-wall experiences that are outside of the mainstream of what people experience day to day, you may have to invent terminology. That there are pitfalls and dangers to that, especially if you find yourself entering into a group of people who are, interested in supporting each other and being happy human beings, and there are tons of them. They're all going to have their own language. And understanding that when entering into that group, there are pitfalls, there are dangerous things that sometimes people who are not members of the groups may resent. The additions to the language, that sometimes you run the risk of spending a lot of time learning about syntax instead of the actual experience, the semantic content of those terms. If you can avoid those two dangers, you can get the tremendous benefit of being able to recall and investigate things more easily, getting your pattern recognition hardware working for you in pointing out the sorts of things that you're trying to be on guard for, and have a little bit more success in practicing being a happy human being.